Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and I really hope you're not sick of me just yet, as we are back for another GPU review. This time around it's AMD's turn, as we're checking out the RX 7600 XT that was announced back at CES earlier this month. This one is all about the VRAM and the upgrade to 16 gigs on a graphics card that costs £310 or $329. Let's find out if it's worth buying. So if you did miss the announcement at CES earlier this month, the RX 7600 XT is very easy to summarise. It's using the exact same Navi 33 die as the RX 7600 non-XT, with an identical number of cores, RT cores, ROPs and so on. There's really just three key areas of difference which make this GPU intriguing, the first being a higher clock speed, as the game clock has been increased to 2470 MHz, about a 10% bump over the RX 7600. The headline change is the VRAM, however. To be clear, it is the same 128-bit interface, still 18 gigabits per second modules, so the same memory bandwidth, but instead of 8 gigs of GDDR6, we now get 16 gigabytes. The final change then is power draw, with TBP increasing to 190 watts to allow both for the extra memory, but mainly for the increased clock speeds. Based on those specs then, the thought of a 16GB RX 7600 really didn't get me that excited initially, even with the graphics card costing £310 here in the UK or $329 US. I know games are using more and more VRAM, but do we really need a 16GB version of this graphics card? Well, there's only one way to find out, so I got to testing. For all of this benchmark data then, I of course used my regular GPU test system, which is provided to us by PC Specialist. This is built on Intel's i9-3900KS CPU, paired with the Gigabyte Z790 Gaming X AX motherboard, and we've also got 32 gigs of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR5 memory. All data you're going to see in these charts as well has been collected from Fresh over the last couple of weeks using the latest publicly available drivers from AMD, Intel and Nvidia. It's also worth making clear that there is no reference card for the RX 7600 XT, so it's AIB only, and I was sent the Sapphire Pulse model, which is what I'm using for all of my benchmarking today. The final thing to say is that in this video we are focusing on the 1080p and the 1440p data, as that's really most relevant to this class of GPU. However, I did also test 4K, so if you want to see that as well as every single one of the 230 charts I put together for this review, you can do so over on the written review on kitguru.net, which will also be linked down in the description below. Kicking off the game benchmarks then with Alan Wake 2, at 1080p the RX 7600 XT delivers 48 FPS on average, and that makes it 7% faster than the RX 7600, about level with AMD's own 6700 XT, but 14% ahead of the RTX 4060. 1440p is too much for the 7600 XT at high settings, however, as we saw an average of just 33 FPS but 1% lows of 23 FPS. Assassin's Creed Mirage is up next, and there's basically no difference between the RX 7600, 7600 XT and RTX 4060 at 1080p, as all three GPUs are delivering about 90 FPS on average. The 7600 XT is also 12% slower than the 6700 XT. We do still get a good experience at 1440p though, with the 6700 XT hitting 63 FPS, but it's just 4% faster than the 7600 non-XT and on par with the 4060. As for Cyberpunk 2077, at 1080p we do see a decent lead for the 7600 XT over the 7600, as the new GPU is 9% faster, which must be down to the clock speed bump, as we're not VRAM limited here. Performance is also just 4% behind the 6700 XT. 1440p gaming isn't out of the equation either, with 49 FPS on average, and that's now a 6% gain over the 7600, but it is still a good chunk faster than the RTX 4060, as the 7600 XT comes in 18% faster than that Nvidia GPU. Moving on though to Forza Horizon 5, this is another game with a decent lead for the 7600 XT compared to its non-XT sibling, as it's 9% faster at 1080p while also 8% ahead of the RTX 4060. At 1440p, the lead over the 7600 even increases to 11%, so it is possible there's a VRAM limit creeping into play, as the game does frequently show warning messages on 8GB cards. The 7600 XT is well behind the 6700 XT, however, by 15% here. Next, it should really come as no surprise that The Last of Us Part 1 does show a clear benefit to having more than 8GB of VRAM even at 1080p. Yes, the RX 7600 looks fine in isolation, but the 7600 XT is 25% faster here, which is way more than what we'd see from just the clock speed increase. It's also 15% faster than the RTX 4060, so this is really a good showing for the new AMD GPU. Likewise, at 1440p, the 7600 XT is now 43% faster than the RX 7600, while still delivering a reasonable 46 FPS at ultra settings, and that even puts it on par with the RTX 4060 Ti, so there really is a definite benefit to having more than 8GB of VRAM. There's no such VRAM limit in A Plague Tale Requiem, however, and the 7600 XT is barely any faster than the RX 7600. Clearly, the engine just isn't overly sensitive to the increased clock speed on the newer GPU. The same goes at 1440p, though the 7600 XT does at least give us an 8% lead over the RTX 4060, but it's also 8% slower than the 6700 XT. Ratchet and Clank is another game where we know 8GB cards can struggle even at 1080p. Couple that with the fact that AMD GPUs also struggle in this game, and the RX 7600 non-XT drops off a cliff, whereas the 7600 XT is infinitely better. Well, maybe not infinitely, but it is almost twice as fast. The same goes at 1440p. I honestly think there might be a specific issue with 8GB AMD cards in this game, as the RX 7600 performance is so poor, but those issues are all alleviated by the RX 7600 XT, which is also 14% faster than the RTX 4060 at 1440p. As for Red Dead Redemption 2, the 7600 XT is 5% faster than the RX 7600 here, as it delivers 61 FPS. It's not too far behind the 6700 XT or RTX 3070, however, which isn't a bad result, while it also leads the RTX 4060 by a 19% margin. 1440p performance is also decent, hitting 49 FPS on average, though it is now 10% slower than the 6700 XT, and still barely any faster than the RX 7600. We also don't get much of a gain over the 7600 in Resident Evil 4. At 1080p, the 7600 XT is just 4% faster than the non-XT model, while it sits 6% ahead of the RTX 4060, and it's really in a similar ballpark to Intel's A770 16GB. The frame rates are still very respectable at 1440p though, hitting over 60 FPS, but the gains just aren't there compared to the 7600, while the RX 6700 XT is considerably faster. Returnal is another interesting one to look at, as it's actually the first game we've tested where the 7600 XT is actually slower than the RTX 4060 at 1080p. Admittedly not by much, but it is 5% behind and still barely ahead of the 7600. It's a very similar situation at 1440p too, with the 7600 XT just a touch ahead of the 7600, but still behind the RTX 4060 by a 5% margin, while it's also 16% slower than the RX 6700 XT. Moving on though to Starfield, this actually gives us one of the bigger leads for the 7600 XT over the 7600 that we will see today, as the XT model is 11% faster at 1080p. I really don't think VRAM is an issue here, but the results were repeatable after several runs. That margin drops at 1440p, however, to just a 6% difference between the two GPUs, so it's likely just due to the extra clock speed on offer from the 7600 XT. It's also fair to say that AMD absolutely kicks Nvidia's butt in this game as well, as the 7600 XT is 24% faster than the RTX 4060. Finally, we close out with Total War Pharaoh, which is a pretty limp way for the 7600 XT to finish. Not only is it barely any faster than the 7600, It's also 11% slower than the RTX 4060 and even behind the RTX 3060, so it's really not the best look for this new GPU. The same also goes at 1440p, where it's now 16% slower than the RTX 4060, while barely coming in 3% faster than the RX 7600. Overall then, across the 12 games I tested, the RX 7600 XT comes in 12% faster than the RX 7600 on average. It should go without saying, but of course this is highly game dependent. If I didn't test any games that benefit from more than 8 gigs of VRAM, then the margins would be even smaller. To illustrate that, removing The Last of Us Part 1 and Ratchet and Clank from the average figure sees the margin drop to just a 6% gain over the RX 7600. Still, these are the 12 games I've chosen to test, and across them we see a 12% margin on average, while it's 7% faster than the 4060 and 11% slower than the RX 6700 XT. Up at 1440p, the 7600 XT is still decent at this resolution, and here it offers 13% better performance than the 7600 non-XT. It's also 8% faster than both the RTX 4060 and Intel A770 16GB, while the 7600 XT also comes in 13% slower than the 6700 XT. With a UK MSRP then of £309.99, the RX 6700 XT is 19% more expensive than the RX 7600, while being 12% faster in my testing. Of course, that means the overall value is slightly reduced, with the XT having a cost per frame that's 7% higher than the non-XT model. It is still rather competitive, up there at the top of the chart, and of course, the more games that see a benefit to having more than 8GB of VRAM will result in even better value for the 7600 XT. Not a whole lot changes in terms of cost per frame when looking at data based on current retail prices. The one exception is the RX 6700 XT, which is 13% faster than the 7600 XT, while it retails for just £340 at the moment. It does have less VRAM, but it could still be a strong alternative to consider. Moving on though to take a look at ray tracing performance, I'm going to breeze through this part of the video and I'm only going to show 1080p benchmarks for reasons that will become clear, but this is still an area I wanted to test. Kicking off with Alan Wake 2 then, there's really not much to say here. Using the RT High preset with path tracing enabled, you're just not getting a playable experience from this class of hardware, even with FSR quality enabled, so we'll quickly move on. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is just about manageable with the 7600 XT, but it's not super smooth and only 5% faster than the 7600, while it still loses out to the RTX 4060 by 7% at 1080p. Next up then we come to Cyberpunk 2077, and once again the ultra settings we use for testing are too much for most of these GPUs, with the RX 7600 XT barely hitting 20 FPS, and that actually makes it 34% slower than the RTX 4060. F123 is much more competitive though, and we see similar performance to the RTX 4060 at 1080p. It's also 5 FPS faster than the RX 7600 non-XT, which doesn't sound like much but does work out as a 16% difference, so perhaps a hint of VRAM limitations coming into play with the 8GB card. In Hitman 3, we're once again looking at a sub 30 FPS result for the RX 7600, where it's 19% slower than the RTX 4060, and I'm sure by now you are getting the picture. The ray tracing data in Ratchet and Clank though only confirms what we already knew, as the extra 8GB of VRAM really helps compared to the RX 7600. Granted, the 7600 XT is still well below 30 FPS, while it's also 28% slower than the RTX 4060. Moving on to Returnal, and this one does okay at 1080p with ray tracing enabled, hitting 47 FPS, though it is still clearly behind the RX 6700 XT and RTX 4060, losing out to those two GPUs by 10% and 19% margins respectively. Finally then, we're going to finish up with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I deliberately include this game as it's a bit older and only features a single RT effect, that being ray trace shadows, so performance is a bit better than what we see from most other RT games. Even then, AMD just can't match Nvidia for ray trace performance, with the 7600 XT still coming in 17% slower than the RTX 4060 at 1080p. Overall then, looking at the 8-game average, it is clear that ray tracing is not one of the 7600 XT's strengths. It might be manageable in certain games if you only use a single ray traced effect, just like we saw in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but overall performance is 20% behind the RTX 4060 at 1080p. Time to hit pause though on all of the benchmark results, and we're going to take a quick look at the Sapphire Pulse card I was sent before assessing its thermal and acoustic performance. To be honest, it does look like every other Sapphire Pulse card I have reviewed over the last year or two. That's not necessarily a bad thing though. The black shroud with its red accents look fine, but it's certainly not what I would call a particularly beautiful card, though I'll be happy to hear from you if you disagree. I do still like that it comes with a metal backplate however, while it also features two 100mm fans using Sapphire's angular velocity fan blade design. It's also relatively compact, at least by modern standards, measuring 250 by 129.3 by 44.6mm, and it weighed in at just 796 grams on my scales. Power is delivered by two PCIe 8-pin connectors, which does seem a bit excessive considering the 190W TBP, but at least you know there's plenty of headroom. Display outputs finally consist of two HDMI 2.1 and two DisplayPort 2.1. Starting off this section then with a look at clock speed. Of course, I've only tested one RX 7600 XT, being this Sapphire Pulse, so we currently have no other comparison points. What we did observe in terms of clock speed, however, was a general trend around the 2700 MHz mark. There are a few spikes both up and down at certain points, but overall, the card averaged 2698 MHz over our 30-minute stress test in Cyberpunk 2077. Of course, no comparison data also means we can't yet know for sure how good the Pulse's cooler is, but with a GPU temperature of 69 degrees, it looks good enough. The hotspot is higher admittedly at 90 degrees, but we did see similar from the RX 7600 non-XD Sapphire Pulse, and it is still well within safe limits. Moving on though to noise levels, and this is traditionally a strong area for Sapphire's graphics cards, and that is no different here. We saw fan speeds of just 25% or 1180 RPM during our testing, resulting in whisper quiet noise levels of just 33 decibels. I'm also happy to report that I didn't notice any coil whine during my testing. Moving on then to take a look at power draw. As a reminder, for all of this testing, we use Nvidia's PCAT tool to measure power draw of the graphics card only in every single game we test at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. If you do want to see data from a specific game, you can check that out on the written article over on kitguru.net, but just so we're not here for hours, in this video I'm going to take a look at the average results. As we know, given the 10% increase in clock speed over the RX 7600, AMD also had to increase the 7600 XT's power draw, and that is very clear from our testing. At 1080p, for instance, it drew an average of 184.7 watts, which is a hair below the rated 190W TBP, but still enough that it works out as a 19% increase compared to the RX 7600. Power draw is also about 70 watts or 61% higher than the RTX 4060, while it's dead level with the RTX 4070. Of course, that has clear implications for efficiency, and given the 19% increase in power draw over the RX 7600 for 12% more performance, the RX 7600 XT is a step down in performance per watt. Remember, the RX 7600 wasn't very efficient to begin with, sticking with TSMC's 6nm node, so making things worse isn't particularly great. Overall performance per watt is now below the last generation RTX 3070, and it's barely any better than the RX 6700 XT. That brings us to the end of the RX 7600 XT review then, and I have to say I have very mixed feelings about this graphics card. First things first, it's not really the most exciting of launches, as it's not giving us a new GPU die or anything like that. It's literally the existing RX 7600 but with 16 gigs of VRAM and higher clocks. Though, that being said, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Of course, it still would have been nice to see a bigger improvement in raw performance over the RX 7600, as there is still quite a large gap between this XT and the RX 7700 XT. Based on my testing, in the games where VRAM doesn't matter, though we will come back to that, I only saw the RX 7600 XT outperforming the 7600 by 6% due to its higher clock speed, which I guess is better than nothing, but it's hardly anything to get excited about. The 7600 XT also doesn't do anything to improve memory bandwidth, so performance does still drop off slightly at 1440p relative to cards with 192 or 256-bit memory interfaces. Ray tracing performance is still well behind Nvidia, and overall efficiency is actually worse than the RX 7600 due to the 30-watt power increase. Even with all of that being said, I do have to be honest, I kinda like this GPU. We already talked about the gains over the RX 7600 in titles where VRAM doesn't make a difference, but in those games where there is a benefit to having more than 8GB of VRAM, well, the differences can be huge. Just take a look at The Last of Us Part 1 or Ratchet and Clank, where we saw absolutely massive differences. With that in mind, I do think the RX 7600 XT will appeal to a particular niche. I'm thinking about the kind of person who only plays games at 1080p or 1440p, but always wants to use ultra settings and always wants to play the latest AAA games on day one without necessarily spending a fortune on their graphics card. I really couldn't tell you how many people that would actually apply to, but if that is you, then buying the RX 7600 XT over the 7600 or another 8GB card like the RTX 4060 really would give you a real benefit. We've already talked several times over the past year about how more and more games are using more than 8GB of VRAM even at 1080p, and well, the 7600 XT is a solution to that. We do have to give a mention to the RX 6700 XT however, as that GPU is on sale for as little as £340 here in the UK, while it's about 13% faster based on my testing. Yes, the 12GB frame buffer may not be as large, but I still think that will be fine for this class of GPU, as realistically you're not going to be enabling ray tracing on either of these cards. RX 6700 XTs do appear to be slowly disappearing though, as I took a look at Overclockers UK earlier today, and all of their models were either up for pre-order or out of stock, while Scan simply wasn't listing any 6700 XTs at all. At the end of the day then, the RX 7600 XT solves a specific problem. It certainly won't be for everybody, and is definitely not the most exciting GPU launch I can remember, but a 16GB graphics card that can play almost any game at 1080p ultra settings, priced at just £310, well, that really doesn't sound too bad to me. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and ding that notification bell so you don't miss out when we upload a new video. And if you want to carry on the conversation, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description. While you're there, you can also find a link to our merch store where you can pick up a cool new t-shirt like the ones on screen. And finally, if you're feeling particularly generous, you can even consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.